All right, so as Melanie mentioned, my name is Liz Krznarich. I work at Orchid, and usually I am behind the scenes pushing buttons as a web developer, but they've let me out of my basement lair for the day to talk to you about persistent identifiers, or PIDs, or PIDs, as some people call them. But first I have a story. So I once made a legendary cake. It was not an average box cake mix sort of thing. It was a homemade dark chocolate cake with peanut butter filling and this incredible fluffy chocolate buttercream frosting. Sadly, I will never make that particular cake again. So the URL that I bookmarked, that I emailed to myself for that perfect recipe, it's gone. It's vanished. There's nothing there anymore. So no more legendary cake. I've made some other cakes since then, like this really disappointing creation that I made for another friend's birthday, but that's not legendary in the way that I wanted it to be. So I'm trying to recreate it, but I just can't without that specific recipe. How did this happen? It was there for a long time, and then one day the recipe, it was just gone, disappeared. Isn't the internet invincible? But of course we know that it's not. So things on the internet change places, they come and go, they change names, just like things in real life do. And this is not just a problem for cake. So we have lots of stuff that we want to be able to find indefinitely. In scholarly publishing, we have things like publications and data sets. In the real world, we have people in organizations that are connected to those things that we want to keep track of. And it's not just about finding things, but also being able to cite those things and reproduce those things, and also make connections between them. So the organization that an author is affiliated with, who wrote a paper or created a data set that served as the basis for a paper. So how do we handle this? So persistent identifiers, or PIDs, to the rescue. So to break that down, we have the identifier part. We all know what that is, a string of characters like a driver's license. And the persistent part means that that identifier always points to that specific thing or some representation. But how does that work? So we have a thing, like an article, that has an owner or someone who's responsible for it. They send a little bit of information about that thing and where it's located into a system that generates persistent identifiers, and out pops the persistent identifier. When we want to get back to that thing, we can type in the persistent identifier. It goes back through the system that says, hey, I know where that thing is. Here you go. All right, so we can find our things and probably cite them, but what about this whole making connections between other sorts of things? So one of the neat ideas about persistent identifiers is inside of that information about the thing, we can usually embed other persistent identifiers that point out to other systems and link things together. So I've used the word systems a lot. There are so many systems, lots of them for different kinds of things. So I'll give you a quick tour through a few of them, and this is not exhaustive, so if I've left out your favorite persistent identifier, I'm sorry. So we'll start out with DOIs, which probably a lot of you are familiar with, digital object identifiers. This is kind of the granddaddy of persistent IDs. We use them for publications, data sets, and all sorts of other digital stuff. These are the IDs that start with a 10 and are followed by a bunch of other letters and numbers. For people, we have systems like ISNI and Orchid, which are both 16-digit identifiers. The difference between, or one difference between the two of them is ISNI is sort of top-down, where they assign numbers to people. Orchid is a little more bottom-up, where researchers register for IDs. Then we have organizations, so academic institutions, government organizations, businesses, associations. Two of the players in that space are Ringgold, which is a proprietary system, and then a sort of newer player in that space, a little bit more open, is GRID. We have persistent identifiers for funding. One of the systems there is Crossref's Funder Registry and Funder Data, formerly known as FundRef. It's really a combination of a DOI that represents a funder plus the award ID that's specific to that funder. And then some of the newer types of persistent IDs are for scientific materials and samples, and there are tons of these. RRIDs for antibodies and organisms and cell lines, COD IDs for crystal structures, ISGNs for rock samples, and lots of others. So what next? So PIDs are becoming a pretty hot topic. They even have their own conference now. So the first PIDapalooza was held back in November, and people came up with all kinds of ideas for the next new hot PIDs. So for things like projects, data management plans, scientific protocols. Sadly, no PIDs yet for cake recipes. Maybe at the next PIDapalooza, but until then, don't ask me to cater your next party. That's it for me.